we need to make sure we're in compliance by making this statement. And so I'll just share it here. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So now that that's out of the way, we can go into just an overview of the agenda, which is just the welcome and call to order, which we just done in the statement, and then roll call and attendance. Dominique, how would you like to do the roll call and attendance?
I have been trying to capture who's on the call, so I can read off what I have, and then if I've missed anyone, they can let me know.
Sounds great.
So I have Wendy, Maya, Senator Potty, Trey, Dr. Naba McKinney, Sherry, Dwight, Latoya, Blair, Jennings, Josh, Tom, and Bob. Have I missed anyone?
This is Melanie. I'm here.
Thank you.
All right, I think I'll
turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dominique. And so just as a friendly reminder, to maximize your experience in the committee, we want to make sure that you review the PowerPoint decks that are sent out. And particularly as relates to this meeting, there were some resources that were shared in our folder that would be a good place for us to start. I know there's so much information out there. And so if you're ever wondering, where to begin or what pieces you should definitely look into, we have a recommendation that you should look at the resource link in this most recent folder, particularly the ECS links, which stand for Education Commission of States. We like those because they're nonpartisan. They're essentially a nonpartisan look into state funding formulas. So that'll be a good place to start. I think also there's one more link, the link to EdBuild. That's another resource that would be helpful if you don't get a chance to look at all the links. So just wanted to share that information. Also, the other piece too around stakeholder communities, making sure you engage with them. You essentially can meet with folks as long as you want and to, essentially whenever you want, because as representatives of this subcommittee, we want to make sure we're getting as much feedback as possible and a diverse array of feedback. And with that, as long as we're communicating with the folks in our communities and folks even beyond our communities around this work, we'll be able to bring as much information to bear that will inform the work that we're doing. So just wanted to highlight that as well. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of what we want to do for moving forward for this current meeting, highlighting essentially what our expertise is. We mentioned this on the last call, so we can go 2 slides. We can go to another couple of slides. Back a couple, well, we can state it, that's fine. Because essentially just want to reiterate that we are all experts. We bring, whether it's from the personal experience we have with students, children, or professional experience that we have with students and children, or a combination thereof. When we think about wanting the best interest, what's in the best interest of our kids and our students across our great state, we want to make sure that we know we're bringing a level of expertise, whether we think it or not. We're on this subcommittee because of the expertise that we bring. And again, there's a range of that. And so wanted to just highlight that. So we feel good about how we're communicating, what we're communicating as we think about funding formulas moving forward. And so just as an overview, we've had a good amount of meetings so far, town hall meetings. We've gathered some feedback. We haven't gathered all the feedback, and we certainly wanted to make sure there was a critical mass before we shared the feedback that we're about to share now. So if you haven't had a chance to review, we're just wanted to highlight some of the high points around the feedback we're hearing across the state, and also wanting to underscore that this isn't all the feedback. We'll continue to have town hall meetings, and as we continue to gather information, again, get a critical mass, we'll be able to share that as well. But we think this is helpful for us to get to, as a group, hear this feedback and then share what we think about that. Are we hearing the same thing with our constituents, our stakeholders? Are there other things that, does this conflict with what we've been sharing as a subcommittee? So as I share this out, and I'll just sort of read almost verbatim as I share this out, just feel free to interrupt as you want, or we can wait until all the feedback is given, and then we can share our thoughts around that. And so in terms of overall feedback, as we think about just the potential components of a student-based formula, we see that the district, in terms of what's been requested, the district should not receive less state funding than they receive through the current BEP. We want to maintain flexibility for local district budgeting. We want to ensure that whatever is currently funded outside of the BEP is included in a new formula, and the local match component should be stable, what it would be under the BEP for the next 3 to 5 years, which we believe that will be the case. There's no reason why that wouldn't change. Again, I don't have a crystal ball into the future, but essentially there will be a lag anyway. So in terms of what the next 3 to 5 years looks like, what we currently have the local match component at least should stay stable. And so if we go to the next slide, when we look at the base, the feedback for the base includes the content currently being discussed in subcommittees, i.e. ours. Below are the resources that have been consistently named in public feedback. And so just want to share some of those high-level bullets in terms of the trends that we want to be considered for the base funding formula aspects. So nurses either at every school or at the nationally recommended ratio, counselors either at every school or at the nationally recommended ratio, school psychologists at the nationally recommended ratio, teacher salaries and benefits, and then flexibility for facility funding and or deferred maintenance. We can go to the next slide. And again, feel free to stop me if you have any questions, but again, I'm almost done with this, and we can, I have a couple more slides after this. So we can then discuss if need be, or we should discuss actually. So this one is around weights. This one might be not the most complicated, but the one that we haven't really addressed as a state when we think about how we're thinking about the new funding formula. So in terms of what the feedback that we're getting, when I think about our own subcommittee and some of the things that we've highlighted, a lot of this aligns with what we've been sharing, but some of this might not, or might not have been things that we've discussed. But the few bullet points here are economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty, a weight for that. Students and disabilities with tiers based on the cost to provide those services. English learners, and what's interesting about this is what's been recommended is to include tiers based on English proficiency. Another weight around rural sparsity. And then the last two weights that have been suggested around fast growing districts and charter enrollment. Areas that we haven't received as much feedback that have been previously considered for weights include gifted students, dyslexia, small LEA sizes, K2 small class size weight, and I think that's it, yeah. In terms of additional dollars in the next slide, the following are the areas that received the most positive feedback in terms of what might be considered for additional funding. So funding around financial literacy, middle school CTE, innovative high school models, extended school year, RTI, and high dosage tutoring. And then lastly, in terms of outcomes, the following are the areas that received the most positive feedback in terms of what may be considered for outcomes. Early post-secondary opportunity completion, AP course completion, earning industry certificates or certification, work-based learning completion metric, closing the achievement gap, reading proficiency, and differentiated compensation support. So I know in our last committee meeting, we essentially wanted to list the resources that we wanted to include in the BEP or in the new formula, but also we wanted to prioritize those based on what we thought we really needed, a must-have, nice to have, so on and so forth. But before we jump back into that, really wanted to just get you all's feedback around what I just shared in terms of what we're hearing across the state, and wanting to see if that's what we're also hearing. Does that resonate with us as a group? Why or why not? So we can start the discussion there before we jump into those resources.
And I have also loaded the comments that you all made last week, and we put in that Google Drive. I've put that in the chat.
Thanks, Dominique. So what are your all's thoughts?
I'll make a comment. I think.
Oh, sorry. This is my. I was just going to say I appreciate the comment there about gifted education, because we don't talk a lot about that at all across the state, and what resources are needed to properly support and educate our kids in gifted classes, especially in majority Black and Latino schools in the city. We talk about in our rural schools. So I'm very pleased to see that posted here, and I want to know what has been a reaction across the state to folks bringing up gifted education and the need to potentially include that in the funding formula or as a part of the special education weight as well.
Thank you for that, Maya. And see, we have a few hands raised. So I see Blair, Dwight, and Dr. Nabo McKinney. Maybe we can start with Blair.
Thank you, Darwin. Good morning, everybody. I think a lot of that was consistent. There was an article in the Tennessean that I thought did a nice job of kind of summarizing some of the takeaways, kind of from at least from a reporter's perspective of the town hall meetings. And it seems, consistent with certainly a couple of first slides that you put up there, Derwin, which around sort of mental health, nurse, primary care health in schools, behavioral health, psychologists, those kinds of things. And then it did also speak to the how sort of economically disadvantaged children and special needs children were children with disabilities had been highlighted a lot. So I thought it seemed consistent with, at least those parts seem very consistent with what the coverage, by the media has been.
Thanks, Blair. Dwight?
Hello. Trying to catch up because I missed most of the first two meetings. I'm just now looking at this document here. But from the slides that were shown, I have a couple of comments. I think the increase in school nursing and counselors were right on point. And I kind of question about maybe increasing access to preschool as well into that. And on the other slide about what you expect our students to do after high school, I think the focus on the early credits, college credits, and AP, and especially pushing the retake of ACT test as a option. I think that's really important for students everywhere to be able to have that access. Now I'm now looking at this document, might add some more stuff into this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dwight. And Dr. Nabo McKinney.
Hey, hey everyone. I think I agree with the consistency that has been reported on some of the slides. One thing that I did not see is teacher professional development. There has been a large emphasis on professional development for educators, and more funding allocated towards that. That has been a lot of parent feedback related to that. I attended a session yesterday hosted by the I'll come back to the name of the organization. But during that session, a lot of talk was on not only the mental health, nurses, and all of those components, but advanced academics and professional development.
Thank you for that. And with that, I'm curious to see from those who spoke and others, are there any items that or any resources or I would say line items that we think are missing that haven't been discussed or haven't been shared in that overall feedback from across the state? I see you, Blair.
Yeah, I think certainly in this group, we've heard a lot around preschool and the importance of expanding opportunities for that and accessibility and for preschool opportunities. And I'm not sure if that has to do with sort of how the groups are organized, but I think that's super important.
I'm glad you said that because yeah, I saw the K2 piece. That's probably the closest we got to it, but definitely not early enough. So I'm glad you highlighted that.
Well, and just I think it's in part, a function of it's billed as K-12 funding reform, and so oftentimes, we're programmed to think in that frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. I think, similarly, I noticed while facilities has been addressed and whether it's deferred maintenance, what have you, I think it still gets to, for me, what I think is a must-have, but likely won't make the cut anyway, is just around facilities around schools. And so similarly, we see the school proper as the only facility we should be addressing, but obviously our kids are coming from other facilities for other parts of the day, and it'd be good for us to find ways to address that, whether it's in partnership or what have you. So glad you highlighted that. Latoya?
I had to get off mute. I was looking at the funding breakout table that was in this week's folder, and looking at let me go to it, make sure I'm saying it right. Resources for student success, trying to see the average student and where they benefit from the additional funding. I kind of don't see it. If you have your children English language learning, your special education, we talked about the gifted, but what about the average student that doesn't go to school every day? They're B, C, sometimes an A student. They don't have, much need for like excess counseling. They're just a student in school, but I don't see anywhere we can advance them in this formula.
And you're referring to, so outside of the base, if we're talking about the weights right now, if I'm hearing correctly, the weights address students with other kinds of needs, and you're saying, what about this, the student that doesn't have any of those needs listed in the weights? What are we doing for them, or how do we consider further investment in them? Am I hearing you correctly?
That is correct.
Okay. So definitely make note of that. Anyone have any thoughts around that?
During in our conversations with the state and department, to our understanding that they were planning to add, I don't want to give it a direct number, but millions and millions of dollars across the base so that the amount of money per kid, regardless of if they fall into one of those weighted categories, would go up. That almost all districts across the state would receive an increase in base for the funding formula for each kid.
That would definitely address what Toya just brought up. So it'd be great if that happens. I think, I think we all agree that funding needs to go up overall. And so in that case, that would certainly address students that might not fit within the buckets of the different weights, but still they would get that increase as well. So helpful. I see, Bob, you had your hand raised for a while.
Hey, yeah, so I think, Derwin, just I have a thought, but I also want to just make sure I'm crystal clear on the question that's being asked. I mean, if we're saying what are things that we want to make sure are accounted for in adequately funding schools, and is there anything else missing from the list? Well, I mean, I think you are absolutely right on the facilities piece, particularly in a charter setting. it is a gigantic issue. And so anything the state can do to look at that either through this initiative or another really should be thought about. I mean, I think that's a fundamental question about, and I think the state obviously has this assumption that it's local governments that are primarily responsible for school facility funding, and then charters are sort of like not really thought of in that. It's really like up to the local government whether they want to include us, and then we get a little something from the charter school grant from the state to try to fill in the gap. Is there a way to adjust that more fundamentally through this? I don't know, but I would agree with you. That's a big question. Other things that maybe aren't on the list yet that in general we might talk about, the commissioner has spent a lot of time in the last year or two talking about quality instructional materials, right? And that's a really big question. The cost and appropriateness and standards alignment of instructional materials is a huge question around the state. And, should that be on the list? Maybe. All that being said, I think I would worry too much about having this like long laundry list so that the most important points are sort of like lost, right, in the length of the list. And so that's like the general point I would make. I think we have to say like, what are the like one or two or three like absolutely most salient and critical things that funding needs to be adjusted for? Like, what are the student-based needs that, like everyone needs more money for good instructional materials. But if what we're trying to do is design like a responsive student-based funding formula, then what are the individual factors, like significant special education needs or English language learning or high poverty background? I mean, to me, those are the three that really should be the difference maker in the formula for individual students, more so than the very valid long list of things we could all agree on that we want to have more of in our schools. So I think that would just be like the procedural clarification that I'm wondering about, Derwin. And if you'd allow me, the very, very last thing is, as we make a wish list, I also want to make sure we don't fall back inadvertently into like a BEP style way of thinking, which is like, well, every school that has X has to have this, and every school that has that number of middle school pupils has to have 0.75 librarians, right? It's like, that's one of the flaws of our model, right? And what we want to do is allow schools and districts to be flexible in their use of appropriate student funding to meet those needs. And so, yes, we should be thinking of all the things we want, but I think we want to be careful that we don't. And I don't think this is the state's intention, but I guess this is just a procedural clarification, right? By listing the things that are important, we're not saying now we have to say that this is what schools have to spend their money on exactly, right? So I think those would be just my two general sort of procedural questions or points.
So from a procedural standpoint for this question, it's just around what we've been hearing at town halls. Does that line up with what we've been hearing as a subcommittee? Does that line up with what we've been thinking as a subcommittee? So that's the first one. The second procedural question that I think you've asked is really around what are we doing with this list that we're making, essentially? How are we approaching what we're doing? Is this, once we create the list, is it are we democratically voting to say we all agree that we should put funding in X box versus whatever? And that's not the case. We're essentially compiling all of this information right now as subcommittees and then bringing that information back to each subcommittee to continue to share out. Similarly, what we're doing with the town halls to say, this is what we're collectively wanting to do. Now, how do we agree on a final approach to get to that place? And right now, we're still just discussing what the base looks like, what weights look like, and is that an approach we want to take in the first place? And if we do, these are some models, and that's why we listed some of those resources, how other states are doing it. I've recommended that at the last meeting, based on Commissioner Swinn's recommendation, that we focus on those states that most closely align with Tennessee. So not looking at New York or DC, but looking more like at Indianapolis or Indiana and Georgia, because their funding in terms of what their tax base looks like compared to our tax base and how we fund schools is they're more closely aligned. So just, I hope that answers your question, Bob. But for this first part, it's based on what we're hearing across the state at these town halls. Does that line up with what we're hearing? And what are some things that we should be thinking about as we receive that information?
And I will add that, you all have a really good list going. We can just keep, adding to that list, but we can also start putting those in those categories. And I can pull that slide up in a minute when you're ready, Derwin, of the must-haves and the should-haves. And then I think you can start looking at those must-haves and should-have boxes after you finish, after you feel like you've got a really good prioritized list. Think of them as, okay, so we're building a formula. These are our blocks. Now, where do we think these should go? Should they be in the base? Should they be in the weights? So that's kind of the process that you will be going through in the next little bit today, next meeting, adding, some of the pieces of the feedback as well.
Dominique, is that in the Google Drive, that list in the Google Drive for this meeting?
The list is, I put it in the chat. It's just kind of a shared link right now.
Okay, got it.
I've been capturing the things that you all have said maybe we're missing in a different document, and then I'll put them over. And whenever you all are ready to start categorizing, I can help do that piece as well.
And I think unless there are other comments or questions around what was shared at the town halls, we could begin, just given that we have just about 30 minutes left, and I know this could take some time. So we could begin that process now, unless someone else has something they want to add to the town hall feedback.
Derwin, I do want to kind of bring awareness that we are also switching the models that we're using. So the BEP was based on resource-based funding model, and from what I understand, the state is moving towards a more student-based budgeting model, or student-weighted based budgeting model, which shifts the way we look at how funding allocations happen.
Thank you. That's a helpful clarification.
I think I just have one other clarification or question too, Derwin, just if you wouldn't mind. Just I'm looking at the slide that you had put up that was the outcomes slide. And just talk a little bit about this. I don't know that we've discussed this in our subcommittee per se. Should we be talking about outcomes in this subcommittee? Is that a important discussion topic?
So we should be talking about outcomes, whether we're talking about that this meeting or next. I'm just going off of memory from the original list we created. We started to get to outcomes in terms of some of the things we thought were important for student success. And I'm not sure if you remember, Blair, we started to have a conversation around, it's not always about to and through college. There are other avenues that speak to academic success to show that we're doing what's best for students. So as we started to talk about other pathways, we led a little bit into this outcomes territory, but we definitely did not go deeply into it to essentially get to what we have on this slide here. So these are just some of the things that we're hearing at town halls, not what subcommittees have come up with so far. Just wanted to clarify that. So
that's just input. Got it. Okay. Because the reason I say that is because I've heard some folks talking, some legislators and others talking about a potential for an outcomes, kind of oriented funding component. And so I just wondered, is there some leaning into that, in terms of this conversation? So.
And we can certainly lean into that. So it looks like we can dive in shortly, unless I see Bob still has his hand raised, and Sarah Carpenter, welcome, has her hand raised. So maybe we could start with Sarah.
Hello, all. Derwin, I'm kind of way behind on this subcommittee. For some reason, and I've been going through a lot, so I just want to get caught up. If it's any way possible, I can get caught up.
Yeah, so we can, Dominique and I can set time offline to catch you up, or
that's fine.
I can also send the links of the recordings to our first two meetings after this as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. I think maybe if you want to start with the videos, and if there's something that you feel like is still missing, happy to catch you up that way, or we can catch up before you watch the videos. However way I or Dominique or both could be accessible to you, and anyone that wants to be caught up, just let me know.
I would love to start with the videos. Thanks.
Okay. And Bob, it looks like you have another question.
Yes, I forgot to lower my hand, but since this came up, I mean, can I just say this on the point that Blair was speaking to? I absolutely agree that we need to have a robust accountability model in the state for school performance, but I think that we need to distinguish the question of accountability for outcomes from the question of basic school funding. They're both important and they have to exist in relation to each other, but they can't be the same thing. When we are talking about fundamental issues of basic equity, if a child with cerebral palsy is funded at the same level as a typically able middle-class child, which is true today, we can't even start the conversation about serving them. And so to say, well, here's the outcome metrics that you're going to have to get to even get that money before we've even anteed up to serve that child seems to me putting the cart before the horse. I am 100% in agreement that it needs to be paired with, and we've done that. We have an extremely robust, we have one of the most rigorous, demanding high bars for academic accountability in our state. The problem is not that we haven't set the bar high enough. The bar is very high. You have to be at the 75th percentile nationally to even approach Tennessee's academic standards. So we've created Lake Wobegon, and I think we're right to have high standards. I think I think that I'd be cautious about allowing the accountability conversation to encroach on the funding conversation. This conversation is about what is the appropriate funding that has to follow the child so that students can start to serve them. Then by all means, teachers, leaders, and schools should be held accountable for what we then do with those resources. So I'm not arguing against accountability. I'm just saying to add punitive accountability measures into the funding structure, it seems to me you're then multiplying and doubling and tripling the role of accountability before we've even started to meet adequacy.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, Bob. Just to be clear, this is what we're hearing around outcomes that we should be considering, not what should go into the funding formula proper. And even with that, just to use your language, putting the cart before the horse, we want to make sure that we're not only just funding the horse, but we're also thinking about the cart as well. And so we can't miss what it means to have positive outcomes just for the sake of ensuring that we're looking at accountability only. And so wanted to just emphasize, again, this is just what we're hearing. We want to think about this, and this should come into our conversation as we think about the must-haves, the should-haves, the nice-to-haves, the long shots, however we think about outcomes, but that doesn't mean they need to beat the things we list in our weights and base formula. And so with that, so that we don't run out of time to at least continue this conversation around just the resources that we'd like to see incorporated into the funding formula. If we could maybe, I don't know, Dominique, the best way to do this, is it to bring up the list and share your screen, or, okay.
I can do that. Yep, just give me just a second and I will pull it up.
And again, this is a living document, so we can continue to add to it as we also categorize again, listing out the must-haves, the should-haves, the nice-to-haves, and the long shots.
Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay. I am going to take just a second to go pull over a few of the things that you said and add them to the bottom. And then I will try to get it in a position where it's easily seen.
Thank you.
While we're waiting, I might just, right there, since you're on preschool expansion of opportunities, there's on the list there that you have already, Dominique, from our prior conversations, a strong developmentally appropriate pre-K program to prepare kids early. I would vote to put that at the, elevate that to the must-haves.
This is Melanie, and I totally agree with what Blair said. As we were getting ready to do this, that's exactly what I wanted to say as well, is that developmentally appropriate pre-K is a must-have, because research has shown that the money that you put into the first 5 years, the return you get on that is so much bigger than the return. Sorry, my dog is barking. The return that you put into other ages and grades. I think that's very important that we go there.
Up next, according to an article on Insider.com, in the days following Kyle Rittenhouse's acquittal, Kenosha, Wisconsin, protesters directed.
I think what I may do is just put what people are saying, which category, out beside of the item, and then go later and put them in the proper category. That way you're not having to watch me scroll back and forth. And then, if you all have discussion about this and you're not, people don't agree, we can revisit it and just mark it in some way. I'll highlight it or something like that.
Okay, that sounds great.
Twice in the head, claiming she grew sick of him sexually abusing, trafficking her. So, ladies, what do you think? Should people compare Crystal Kaiser's case to Kyle Rittenhouse in terms of?
And I really appreciate it, Dominique. Sorry to put you on the spot to take the notes live while we reorganize all of this. So really, really appreciate it.
Y'all are just going to have to point me to parts of it, and I'll just go where you tell me.
Derwin, this is Tom. Thanks, Dominique. So we're looking at this list, and the exercise now is just categorizing some or all of this. Is that right?
Yes. If there's anything you want to add to it, let's feel free to do that now. Consider that this is still a living document. In addition, though, or mainly right now, we want to begin prioritizing the must-haves, the should-haves, the nice-to-haves, and the long shots.
So I think you've made the comments here, and certainly in a lot of the watching some of the community sessions, the YouTubes, reading comments. I mean, the statewide themes do seem to be those 3 or 4. The high needs, the special needs have to be elevated. The kids living in poverty, and especially concentrations of poverty, and the English learners. I mean, those, right? And I guess they're all on our list somewhere. I'm not looking at the whole list right now, but again, those seem to be common across the state.
And would you say, Tom, that resonates with what you're seeing just in Shelby County? And that
100%. Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. How do the rest of you all feel about some of these other items? And I know and again, we can find all of this in your resources in the Google Drive. So as Dominique might scroll up or down, if you want to look at a more static document, feel free to. And I believe Dominique, you might have sent that. I know you sent the link out last night for the comments. It might have been a few days ago for the resources. So just look for that email, and you'll be able to pull up in the Google Drive this exact document, the Parent Choice and Voice document that we're working through now.
Do we just want to take it from the top and kind of weigh in on each one?
I think that might be the most helpful, just in case those of you that don't have access right now to that Google resource could actually see the document in real time. It's a great idea. So this first one, all students have access to a well-rounded education. In this case, it's including art. We put that as a should have. If there are no objections to that, we can move on to the next one. If there are, feel free to say that we should bring it up to must-haves or bring it down to nice-to-haves, and we can have that discussion. So maybe we jump into the next one, best practice ratios for nurses and mental health counselors.
I'd say must have, and it seems certainly like the reflection of the comments from the public input seems to have prioritized that, and that's my own personal opinion as well.
I would agree with that.
Derwin, I am so sorry to be difficult. Could I just ask a shorter version of my clarifying question?
Sure.
When we're saying that we think certain items like specialty staff to support mental health are must-haves in a school, which parenthetically I agree with, what is it when we're saying that's a must-have? What does that mean with respect to this project? If what we're actually talking about is a student-based funding formula, not a position-based funding formula. Does that make sense? I think that's just what I'm trying to, or is this more like we're making a list of the things that we have to have, which will then be used indirectly to articulate the need for a larger funding pool or a weighted funding pool that would yield those things, even if we're not sort of like funding specific positions. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it is the latter. By no means right now are we creating a weighted funding formula. We are saying, hey, these things are really important. They are as important as a must-have. And if you look at the actual general overview slide that speaks to what must-have, and I'll just state it so that you all don't have to toggle to it, but what's a must-have are those resources required as a result of federal and or state law for safety or similar. So that would, again, fall in line with the best practice ratios for nurses and mental health counselors. A should have is those resources that may not be mandatory, but are essential to ensure the student or student receives access to a quality education. A nice to have, those resources are not mandatory, not essential, but one, provide a clear and added benefit to students, have a clear return on the investment related to student achievement and future success. And then the long shot are all other resource ideas, so they don't fall into that category.
That's helpful. So
well,
the must
that being the case,
really
all I would.
Sorry, Blair, and then Bob.
So in that spirit, I would just say, as strongly as I believe in mental health and nursing support for kids, and as much as we invested in a school, to me, special ed is such an overwhelmingly critical issue and is federally mandated that that's a must-have, and something like this would need to be one notch down. That would be my honest opinion.
I think I would agree, just unless, I mean, personally, I think it's a must-have for school nurses and mental health counselors, and I think people would characterize it that way. But if you're using the definition that you just said, Derwin, for what must-have is, I just heard you say that's what's federally mandated.
Federal and or state law for safety or similar. So it doesn't have to be federal, it could be state.
But it's law. It's basically, it must have means we have to have it in there because it's state law or federal mandate.
Yes.
Which to Bob's point, special needs children would be in there because of IDEA, federal law, but school nurses and mental health counselors are not required by state law. I'm
not sure. Anyone can confirm that? I actually thought they were, but
I believe they are. The question is a difference of which ratio the law mandates. So the law doesn't always mandate best practice, but there is a ratio that's mandated.
So then in that case, then if we're all in agreement, then particularly around the best practice ratios, which I think is what we are emphasizing in this, then we could bring it down to a should have. Does that work for everyone, or does anyone have an objection to that? Okay.
And that would then be, just going back, since I mentioned, we mentioned, Melanie and I both spoke about developmentally appropriate pre-K. It sounds like that's also not a federally or state mandated. So we're saying, or by law,
that's a should have. That's
a should have. And I guess we should clarify that, available to whom, and for any who would be eligible or who would seek it. I would say any who would seek it.
I know I'm gonna.
Yeah. And I think we just need to be careful too, because while essentially, I think if I'm looking through a crystal ball, which I really don't know how to look through a crystal ball, but let's imagine I did. Essentially, everything that's federally mandated will become a must-have, and then those things that we think should be a must-have, even whether it's federal or state law or not, will be bumped down to should-have. So we're going to have a lot of should-haves, and I think less nice-to-haves and long shots. So just considering just the bulk of what will be in the should-have, and then how we need to then figure out how to bring some things a notch down or not. I just wanted to have that for consideration. And would also love to hear from, I still want to hear from Blair and Bob and others. Want to make sure I'm hearing from folks that we haven't heard from at all too.
So I have a question. So is it possible for the next meeting for us to have the must-haves locked and documented, so that's not something we're toggling over if we know no matter what, that has to be there. And so we can best focus on the should haves and what's the best should haves that we can possibly have outside of our must haves.
We can commit to that. We can, I can work with Dominique to look through those items, and we're not perfect. So we'll look through those items that we believe are federal or state mandates, put notches next to those as a must have. And then essentially we can take those out of the list and put them where they belong. Then from there, work through the should haves, the nice to haves, and the long shots. That's a great suggestion. I see we have Christina.
Yes, sir. Would it be possible just, I don't want to call it a poll, but if you send us the list, that we could send you back a ranked, so at least we're not trying to debate it in group, but you will have received us back a feedback form or a Google form ranking the items?
Yeah, Dominique, how does that sound? I'm considering being considerate of your time. Sounds like if we could even just pause here and maybe use this time to see if there's anything we want to add to the list. And before the next, or by the next meeting, we would have all shared our feedback around how we want to rank these. And then we could essentially show what the rankings look like in terms of the should haves, the nice to haves, and the long shots.
So I could take, this document, when I send you all this link, everybody has access to edit it. So, and it's anonymous. It doesn't, it doesn't say who, other than me, because I'm the owner. I don't think that I think the rest of it is kind of anonymous. So if there's a way that people wanted to go in there and mark on it, this is a living document. So we can take this living document and then put it on one that we do send to the commissioner's team. So you all can, utilize this. We can set this up however you want it to be set up for you to put your own feedback in here throughout the week, between now and our next meeting.
I'm wondering if there's a way to maybe next to each. So first, Dominique, maybe you and I could work offline to figure out how to organize a list to essentially put the must-haves aside. And then for the should-haves and nice-to-haves and long shots, maybe create a column next to it where we then could allow people to go line by line and essentially add their notch to, or denote if they think it's a must-have, nice-to-have, or long shot. We could figure out the best way to denote that so that people can just go in and quickly just read it and rank it how they feel it should be ranked. How does that
we
sound?
can set it up in a chart, I think, and people could go in and tally under the appropriate column where they feel like that falls.
Okay.
Does that work for everyone?
Any objections to that? Okay. So are there any items that aren't on the list that we want to add to the list? I know, Blair, earlier you mentioned we got into a little conversation around or not a little conversation, we got into a conversation around outcomes. Any thoughts around adding just specific resources that would fit into that realm? Or any comments? I'm sorry?
I was just going to make a suggestion of possibly also thinking about that weighted category. So what are the things that we think we need to put into that weighted category that might not be funded in the base, but definitely needs to be funded in some kind of weight, maybe looking at some other states and what they are funding in that weight. I do believe that in the base, I think that the commissioner said in her meeting with chairs, and that is posted, so I will go back and verify this. But so previously in our BEP formula, students with disabilities, ELs, they were funded somewhat in that base. And we need to be thinking about them and the weights for those students in those categories in that weighted category. So you might just start really thinking that might be a place to start of, so what do we need to put extra funding to that is, in that weighted category that would not be funded in the base? Just a thought of how you could look at this next.
What do you all think about that? We have a quiet group this morning. Or I guess afternoon now. Well, Dominique, it sounds like I think we can work offline and represent a document to the group or share out with the group when the document is ready for review. And then we would just ask that our next meeting is on January 4th, I believe. So we would just ask that in advance of that. So really think about the holidays that are coming up. So probably in the next couple of weeks, we'd want to make sure you all take a look at that so that we could continue building on this list. And essentially, it'd be great if by that time we at least have all of the items categorized, and then we're then debating or discussing what we want to add to it or how we want to build on that list or the resources.
Yeah, I think I didn't 100% understand about, I was thinking that the subcommittees are organized according to what might be weighted groups. Dominique, were you saying something else about what we should consider for weighting? And I might have misunderstood that, like in terms of how we're thinking of weighting. Just maybe a little clarification.
There are subcommittees who are absolutely thinking about, I was using that, those areas as an example. But there might be things that this subcommittee wants to focus on considering in that weighted category. I was just trying to give you a lens of focus. You don't have to go that way at all, but there was a little bit of quiet time and trying to think about where to go next. And that was, just a suggestion.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Of maybe focusing and looking at what some other states are doing and waiting and seeing if there's some things in there that you all haven't considered as a subcommittee that you might want to add between now and the next meeting.
That's helpful. So that's a great recommendation that we review those resources that have been provided and chew on that a little bit to see if there's anything we hadn't thought about. That'd be great. That's great. Thank you for that advice.
Is it possible to have direction to those resources? Are they in a special folder?
They are in meeting. There are several things that were loaded in the calendar invite for today's meeting. In that meeting 3 folder, there are links to resources to other, to compare states. Derwin mentioned some on the very beginning of the call, some that you might want to focus on, the ECS and the ED. What was the other one? The Ed Build.
Indiana and Georgia.
I'm sorry.
The Indiana and Georgia.
Well, the Ed Build, the ECS links, so there are several Education Commission of States links. And within those links that share just how different states are looking at funding, I just suggested, per Commissioner Swin's suggestion, that we look at Indiana and Georgia as exemplars when we're comparing states, versus looking at a New York or a DC where their funding is at a much higher level and just wouldn't really be plausible for us to compare. So just as you look at all the states, those will probably be the ones we want to look at. But then there's also the link, which I think is the last resource link on that list of resources, which is a link to EdBuild.
And if anybody is having any trouble finding any of the resources, just please shoot me an email and I will help you. I'll send it in an email. And before Darwin closes today, there's someone on here with on the phone with 615, and I want to make sure you're captured in attendance, 615-300.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Representative Kumar.
Thank you so much.
I think I missed the first meeting or two, and therefore I'm really behind on this, but I have listened to you and I will go through the previous meeting notes and so on and be up to speed and be able to participate better. But this was mainly listening on my part, and thank you for marking me present.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining. And I actually misspoke. The next meeting is on January 7th, not January 4th. And it'll be at 11:30 Central. So same time, same channel, just different day. So with that, if there are no other questions, I think Dominique and I have our homework and our work cut out for us. And so we'll take care of that and get back to you as soon as we can. And if there are no other questions or concerns, I can give you all 2 minutes of your life back. So really appreciate.
Just to double check, you sure it's not January 4th? Because that's what I have on my calendar.
I thought it was January 4th too. Let's double check really quickly.
It is January 4th.
The slides
Yes.
January 7th, so I thought.
Sorry.
Okay.
And actually, the slides
That
are
would be my fault there. It is
So-
January the 4th. And
So
January
is it January 4th or 7th?
the 4th, and we'll send out a calendar invite, but January 4th.
It's on there. Dominique's on it. It's on our calendars. She's already sent it
And
out.
Is there a time for it?
11:30 Central.
Very well.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time, and we'll continue this very robust conversation, and hopefully do what's in the best interest of kids. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.